Welcome and good afternoon, dear brothers and sisters in faith and conscience. I would like to welcome each one of you who has joined us today on Zoom and Facebook Live. Welcome and good afternoon, dear brothers and sisters in faith and conscience. I would like to welcome each one of you who has joined us today on Zoom and Facebook Live. Welcome. Good afternoon to you. For some reason, I'm getting feedback. If you hold for a second, I will be back. Okay, my feedback is gone now. Would like to welcome each one of you on behalf of RFP USA. My name is Dr. Tarunjit Singh Butalia, and I serve as the Executive Director for Religion for Peace USA, or RFP USA. We as an organization envision a nation and world in which people of faith and goodwill learn to live together in respect and mutual support, creating multiple pathways to peace as well as justice. Our mission is to inspire and advance common actions for peacemaking through multi-religious cooperation among our nation's religious and spiritual communities. Our organization has now have almost 50 U.S. national member religious communities that represent the diversity within each of the major and minor faith traditions that call America its home. It is my pleasure today to share with you that we are offering live Spanish translation, and our translator here today is Vasu Bandhu of the Arizona Faith Network. If you would like to hear the Spanish translation, kindly go to the Spanish audio channel on Zoom to listen to the live English translation. RFP USA every month hosts an educational and/or advocacy webinar. Today's webinar is titled Peacebuilding Through Interfaith Dialogue, Lessons from Jain-Muslim Conversations. Our invited speaker today is Professor Dr. Iqbal Akhtar. He is an American academic and public intellectual who has been very well known for his work in religious studies, international relations, and philanthropy. He is currently Associate Professor of Religious Studies and Political and International Relations at Florida International University. He has also served in the past as a program director for the Templeton Religion Trust and has been actively involved in many nonprofit and government roles. He holds a PhD in Interfaith Studies from the University of Edinburgh, an MA in Religious Studies from the University of Denver, and an MA in Political Science International Relations from Tulane University, and an AB in Political Science and Jewish, Islamic, and Near Eastern Studies from Washington University in St. Louis. He is also the founder of Miami Interfaith, an organization that he launched after October 7, 2023 to foster Muslim-Jewish dialogue and interfaith cooperation in South Florida. He's also the proud executive director of the East-West Foundation, a nonprofit that applies Eastern ethics to address issues in undeserved communities. Friends, it is now my pleasure to welcome Brother Dr. Iqbal Akhtar. Welcome, brother. Could you kindly unmute?
Thank you so much, Professor Butalia. Thank you for having me. It's an honor and a pleasure to be here. I'll share with you my slides. Thank you for the very kind introduction. It's really an honor and a pleasure to be able to talk to you all today about some of the work that I have done at Florida International University and more generally, interfaith and the power and the importance of interfaith dialogue. So this is based on some research that I've done, working both on Islamic and Jain texts in the Gujarati language, and then the work that I did as the interim director for Jain Studies at Florida International University. So ours was the first university in North America to have an endowment for Jain studies. And now the Jain community is endowed more than, I think, 35 or 40 universities across North America and Europe and the Middle East now. But ours was the first. And it's an important legacy, an important connection in terms of development of the study of Jainism and its importance in contemporary life. And so I was working with trying to develop Jain heritage in Pakistan. Pakistan has very important Jain sites, and more importantly than that is the Jain philosophy and ideas that, unfortunately, with the partition, that connection between Jainism and Islam that had existed in Pakistan historically was also cut, and it was also in many different ways. The challenges of the partition legacy sort of continue in many parts of the world. And so the question to me in writing this paper that's going to be published in a few months with the Journal of Dharma Studies is really thinking through the challenge that Muslim communities face in the world today, and what are lessons that can be learned from engaging with the Jain tradition with regards to thinking about the idea of ahimsa or nonviolence, and what does that mean, and the complexities of that thought, and to what extent does it integrate or connect with the Islamic tradition of peace or salam. Um, so the very easy kind of narrative that we hear on the television or that we see sort of in popular culture is the idea that Jainism is passive and Muslims are kind of violent, right? We see this in India and other places. Um, and there's a lot of stereotypes with regards to thinking about sort of these two very important traditions, Jainism as an ancient tradition and Islam, as well as having a plurality of viewpoints and perspectives all throughout sort of human history. Now, the question then becomes thinking about ahimsa or the idea of sort of nonviolence with regards to how do we think about what ahimsa is, right? So ahimsa is a type of violence, right, that attracts dense cosmic matter, which binds the soul in suffering. That's part of sort of Jain philosophy, right? And part of what we're trying to do in terms of living our lives within Jainism is to try to either um, burn off that negative karma, and ideally, we'd be living our lives in a way where we're not creating additional forms of karma, right? And whether that's possible, I mean, that there are many different sort of perspectives within Jainism as well. And the idea is not simply within Jainism. All the Dharmic traditions, have some definition or connection to this idea of karma and the afterlife and the soul, or even the idea of no soul. So ahimsa is the quintessence of wisdom within the Jain tradition. Now, what are some of the things that helped that within the Jain tradition cause violence, right? There are two things. One is sort of the intention. The second is the action itself, right? So you separate these two. And within Islam, you also see the separation of these two things and what happens. So you have the bhava himsa, the intentionality behind what that violence is, and then the dravya himsa, or the actual uh, the violence which begins in the mind and then sort of has sort of fruition sort of in the physical, in the material sort of world, right? And I think that's something that's very important, is that within the Jain tradition, within the Dharmic traditions more generally, um, violence is seen, and that's why we try to kind of use these sort of Indic terms, because the idea of violence, say within English, tends to be something that we think of as something physical, right? Something that is happening to someone. But within the Indic tradition, violence is much more complex, and it can be through thoughts, through speech, through action, through intention. It can be based on previous lives. So it's a much more complex idea of what violence is. And it's also due to kind of that passionate activity. And so it's about not only thinking, how do you sort of think about the way that you're living your life, and the intentionality behind it, but also kind of the fruits of those actions as well. So another, again, aside from ahimsa, one of the other very important sort of terms and philosophies within Jainism is anekantavad, right? Non-absolutism, or we can say maybe an easier way of thinking about that is pluralism or plurality perspectives, right? So that reality is understood as a complex set of not only causal factors, but it's complex in terms of the way that can be understood, right? So the way that you would see something taking place is complex based on your background, your identity, the way that you see the world, your own personal experiences, right? So there's a plurality of perspectives, and being able to acknowledge that plurality of perspectives is very, very critical and very, very important, particularly in situations in which there's conflict and there's violence, right? And the most, the most recent work that I've been doing is trying to apply Anakantavad, is in Jewish-Muslim dialogue, and particularly after the Gaza war, October 7th. It's very, very, when people are incredibly polarized, I think that's really where Anakantavad is extremely helpful, because it allows the mediator or the person that's trying to build bridges to be able to see and respond to using different sort of perspectives, right? And so that then allows us to be able to explore, um, and allow people to be heard. And so when people are heard, when people have the ability to see themselves reflected in the other, in someone else, then they are also more open and allows a bridge to be built in terms of peace building. Um, so that's something that's also important, the idea of what truth and perspectives is, because one of the challenges I think that we also have as humans is that when we're injured, um, that truth, that tension, that hurt becomes, it's so deep and so in certain ways overwhelming as well. And so being able to recognize kind of plurality is very important. Now, within the Islamic tradition, you have the idea of salam. So when Muslims, in the Sin Lam Mim, the literal root for in Arabic. So all the Semitic languages, the words have triliteral roots, three letters that end up being sort of the root words. And so this origin, sin lam mim, can be in salam, which means peace. The word of Islam, the name of the religion, Islam, comes from the same, which means submission, or a peace that, in a way, kind of a peace that comes from total submission to God, or to the will of God. It means safety. There are many different sort of ways of thinking about that. And that idea of salam is one of the attributes of God, right? Ar-Rahman, Ar-Rahim. The Quran begins, every chapter of the Quran begins, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, with the name of God, most gracious, most merciful. So this idea is that everything that exists, right? Both the things that are happening to people in this world, as well as the response and the resolution of it, all comes eventually from God, right? And there's a certain type of um, peace that it can exist for Muslims in terms of understanding the divine will in terms of what's happening. And so, and that's very, very important, again, in terms of peace building and work that I do, in Israel and other places. Um, because one of the challenges I think that we deal with in modernity is that we feel, um, because of the ideologies that we live within, we feel that we have to make things happen, that things have to unfold over the course of a human lifetime. And a lot of political ideologies that exist in the world today are very much materialist and presentist. And so the idea of salam within the Islamic tradition historically allows for a type of divine agency to exist. And when you allow divine agency to be factored into reality and conflicts and challenges, that also allows a type of peace to enter into the negotiations and into the resolution of sort of challenges as well. So both Jainism and Islam, again, Bhava and Nia, again, the intentionality is very, very important, right? Inamal amalu bin niyat, right? So actions are also uh, judged by their intention. So even within the Islamic tradition, the idea is that, for instance, if you do something and it turns out badly, but if you had a good intention behind it, you're given a merit by a divine merit, right? There's a God blesses you because of that, even if the thing unfortunately doesn't turn out the way that it ends up happening. So an important part again of the intentionality of work is thinking about how do you um, perfect the character of the individual, right? So one's own character and humility is important in terms of setting an intention and then actually acting, right? And so if you are able to cultivate the character virtues like humility, right? Then ideally, that humility would allow you to be able to see a plurality of perspectives, right? So that there's an intentionality behind that. And the idea then is if you're able to see a plurality of perspectives and ideas, that your actions then that come out of that intention is more likely going to be successful than not successful, right? So one of the challenges we see when people um, don't have positive intentionality or not thoughtful in terms of their actions is that the consequences tend to be much more disastrous, right? Than if you're kind of working intentionally by something. And especially if you're open in terms of intellectual humility, then again, with that intentionality and that purposefulness, then actions tend to be more positive and consequential. From an Islamic perspective, one of the other things that's important as well is that Muslims, as an Islamic tradition, our religious tradition tends to be based historically on the Jewish tradition, right? In terms of it's a very legal tradition. What's acceptable, what's not acceptable. In Islam, it's called halal and haram. What's permitted, what's forbidden, and that's one level of faith. But within the Islamic tradition, there's this idea that there's a higher level of faith. Just because something's permitted doesn't mean it's the right thing to do, is the best thing to do. And so what you really have to do is try to cultivate within one's practice the type of intentionality, the type of openness, the type of pluralism that allows you to a higher level of faith, is taqwa, which is compassion and sort of piety, that again creates a different outcome in terms of both the intentionality and sort of the outcome of that action, right? And so ultimately, that ethical evolution, I think, is helpful for Muslims in engaging with sort of Jain thought, particularly with this idea of sort of nonviolence as one of the guiding intentional principles to action, right? One of the things that's also important for us to think about as well is the Gandhian sort of idea and sort of a Gandhian moment. So Mahatma Gandhi was influenced very heavily by Jainism. So the type of nonviolence, the type of ahimsa that he was talking about is drawing from the Indic tradition, but it's definitely not Hindu, right? So when we look at Bhagavad Gita, it's very clear that that the advice that's being given is to continue sort of the fight, right? Continue because of a much larger cosmological idea of it already happening. It's really the Jain tradition that says that, ultimately there's power in nonviolence. And I think that's, again, something that's very important, that there's a truth in nonviolence that has the ability to transform not just the opponent, but the entire system itself, right? And I think that's something that is also very important for many sort of conflicts that involve Muslims or that are part of the Muslim world, is to be able to explain nonviolence as also being powerful. That nonviolence is not a weakness, it's not sort of an abdication, but it's actually a principled stance. And there's tremendous amount of power in nonviolent sort of resistance, right? So again, what is it? What would be an Islamic framework for that? For tapsia, the idea of sabr, satya, truth, can be understood as, haq or adl, justice or truth, in the Islamic tradition, and ahimsa, the idea of non-harm. We could perhaps think of an sort of a similar idea with regards to Rahma, or this idea of the universal compassion or love for God, for humanity and all of creation, and that ultimately is a non-violent love, right? So, and I think that's something that's important, is that thinking about the divine love for humanity. There's a tradition in the Islamic tradition that there are 100 divisions of God's mercy, and that all of the love that exists in our creation today, in our world today, is only one part of that love, and that 99 parts of God's divine love um, is preserved for the hereafter and for judgment, right? So just a small sliver of divine love accounts for all of the love and the beauty of humanity in the world that we live in, and that's something that's eternal in a way. And so, drawing from that God's sort of eternal love for humanity, you can also think about how that can be powerful and possible? How can you challenge God's divine love in human action in order to transform the opponent or sort of the person that's on the other side? So it's not surrender, and I think that's very important. But it can be active perseverance as a message, right? And as I was saying before, there are also cases of Muslims using nonviolence as a way of trying to change, sort of the political or the social sort of situation. And there's a very, famous sort of example in history with the Pashtuns. So, why is Anekantavad important? This Jain idea. So we talked about Ahimsa, that's important, but Anekantavad is also a very important sort of perspective because it allows us to be able to see a plurality of perspectives. And I think that's another thing that's very, very important and very hard for us to do when people are aggrieved, when they're wronged, when they are upset with decades and decades of violence or oppression or perceived injustice, right? How do you get beyond that? How do you get beyond decades and decades of sort of death? Tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people that have died over the course of a conflict. I mean, how are you able to get beyond that? And I think Ahimsa and Anekantavad from the Jain tradition are very, very powerful ideas that can be adapted, right, by other traditions. It's not taking the Jain tradition, whole and sort of using only the Jain tradition, but what are elements and ideas that exist within Jainism that allow the other tradition to be able to highlight those resources within itself, right? So think of Jainism then more as a spur, an intellectual tool to be able to excavate ideas that exist within that tradition. And Jainism allows a clarity of thinking. It allows a precision that allows then us to be able to excavate within the other tradition those resources, the language, the perspectives that can be used in peace building and conflict resolution, right? And again, I'm not saying that the Jain perspective and Jain ideas are also without fault or without challenges, right? So, I mean, there's very famous peer research that in India, Jains are also, they have a hard time dealing with Muslim neighbors as well, right? So, part of what we're trying to do is that you need kind of this interreligious, ongoing debate, engagement, theological engagement, but also practical engagement. And what you're trying to do is create shared spaces, shared intellectual spaces, which traditions can talk with each other, but also lived spaces. There has to be an architecture of spirituality that exists where people physically are able to engage in dialogue with each other as physical human beings, and being able to engage with difference is very, very important. Again, to translate ideas of Ahimsa and Akantavad into lived reality and physical sort of multicultural, multi-religious engagement. So what are some of the things that kind of I want you to take away from this short discussion? One is that the idea of nonviolence is an indigenous framework. It's not something that is an import, but it's something that is indigenous both to Islam and to Jainism. One of the important parts of that is the idea that that the intentionality is important, that within both traditions, you're judged not just on the actions or the fruit of your actions, but on the intentionality itself. You create an authentic intellectual and spiritual framework by which you can understand different perspectives and also think about different ways in which ahimsa or nonviolence can be used to be able, as a truth, to be able to change situations of conflict, of violence in protracted conflicts, right? And so that there are historically these linkages, at least within the Islamic and sort of the Indic sort of perspectives, but even beyond many different religious traditions. Almost all religious traditions have periods of engagement, of rapid and the growth and the intellectual creativity of religious communities are always through engagement with the other, right? So when they're isolated, right, you see very little sort of engagement in sort of division in development, right? So when we think about even one of the things that I was really quite surprised by, um, I've been in the Southwest. I went for a trip. There was a Native American settlement that I had visited. I had read in my school books many years ago, and I went to go see it. It's somewhere I think in Arizona. It's called Mesa Verde. It's a very interesting. It's like people that Native Americans that had built like um, sort of housing into cliffs. And it was a very interesting perspective. But when you look at like the level of technology, um, it was very, very rudimentary compared to, again, I had done work in Pakistan. And when you go to places like Mohenjo-daro and Harappa, I mean, the level of technology, even 5,000 years ago, is much more advanced than what you see in Mesa Verde, which is, I think, about 1,000 years, I think, at most, in terms of its age. And part of the reason for the lack of technological development, I think, is also the fact that there's a lack of engagement with. So when we look at the Near East, when we look at the ancient Egypt and China and all these other places, innovation takes place when people are constantly crossing, right? When we look at the spiritual breadth and depth of Indic civilization, part of what is there and why it's there is because you have tons of groups that have come in and out of South Asia, trade, conquest, so many things have happened that have forced intellectual, cultural, and spiritual and linguistic development, right? And so it's an engagement with the other that we have the capacity to be able to engage with uh, the deepest aspects of truth and sort of meaning with regards to what it means to be human, what it means to be a spiritual being, and also how do we use faith and spirituality to change the world for the better. So the last slide, I think, is just the idea that truth is many-sided, but peace is the only path. So that's kind of the main takeaway from this work. So thank you.
Thank you, Iqbal, for a very, very fascinating presentation. Something that one does not come across too many times, either on the internet or otherwise. I think was very, very educational, and I'm sure many of our attendees who are with us here would also find the same. Let's begin the conversation. And friends, those of us who are joining us here, please feel free to put your reactions in the chat box. But if you have a question for our esteemed speaker, could you kindly put that into the Q&A box, and we would get to as many of those as we can. Let me begin, Iqbal, asking you this question that I know that since 9/11, the Muslim community has had to engage with many, many religious communities in bilateral and multi-religious dialogue. Why have you engaged with the Jain tradition at this time? Can you help us understand that?
Yeah, sure, no
Why
problem.
now?
Yeah, no, I think that this is a big challenge. I feel I think one of the challenges, I think you're absolutely right. So part of the challenge that Muslims have had is to be able to, so one of the big questions that are constantly coming at Muslims since 9/11 especially is why don't Muslims um, speak out against terrorism, right? So that's kind of a constant sort of question to the Muslim community. And so one of the challenges for American Muslims is being able to articulate our tradition with regards to the idea of violence, right? So not to be defined by terrorism, by violence, but really how do we articulate a positive vision for what Islam is? And Islam not just being the rituals or the beliefs, but what is our larger philosophy with regards to thinking about pluralism, living in a pluralistic society, right? So what is our unique American contribution? What is our unique contribution to America? How do we as Muslims living in America not only live in harmony with other people, but make America a better place? And so I feel like Jainism was one of these traditions that really allowed me to be able to think more deeply about my own tradition. And it was one that, on the surface of it, it's a dialogue that rarely happens as well, right? Muslims and Jains generally are not engaged in intellectual and theological dialogue with each other. And so I think that was something that was very important. And Jainism has these really important ideas of nonviolence. Ahimsa, Anakantavad, and Aparigraha are kind of the three major sort of ideas: the idea of nonviolence, of pluralism, and then also of non-desire non-covetousness or not desiring things. So I've felt that those are very interesting prompts, and I think through that, then being able to explore and explain Islam. So I think Jainism as a vehicle, in a way, weirdly enough, to explain Islam to Christians. So it's a good translator in intellectual tradition and spiritual tradition that allows us to clarify who we are positively to other people. Yeah,
A two-part question. The
sure.
first part is, as an academic scholar, what were your sources on Jainism? And the second is that in the state of Gujarat, Jains and Muslims have lived for a long time
Yeah,
peacefully and violently with each other.
yeah.
How much of does that come into the interest of the staff?
Yeah, no, that's a very, very good question. I mean, we know that there were these Godhra riots in the past in Gujarat, and my own family, my mother's family is originally Gujarati, and they migrated from South Asia to East Africa to Zanzibar, and that's kind of where my family is, and I did my doctoral field work there in Zanzibar and Tanzania. Um, and I think one of the things that I really enjoyed about living in Tanzania, for instance, is how the different Asian communities, right, the Jains, the Swaminarayan, Bhatia, all the different castes, um, historically have lived in peace with each other, and they've always engaged with each other. In fact, my Gujarati teacher was from the Swaminarayan movement. The Jain temple was right next to us where we lived in Dar es Salaam. So that was something that was very, very important. And so unfortunately, what we see in Gujarat today um, is this I think part of it is also kind of just the polarization of India. I think the type of nationalism that's kind of developing now in India is it's it's kind of highlighting a certain idea of what it means to be Indian over other perspectives, right? And it also, again, it's pitting one against the other, and that's not something that's just happening in India. All throughout sort of the world, we're seeing people being pitted against each other. And again, that's something that was really helpful for me in terms of engaging with the Jain community. And so here in the United States, at our university, we have Jain nuns. So generally the Jain monks and nuns are not able to travel out of India because they become polluted and it's not pure. But there's a semi-ordained type of nun from a tradition within Jainism, and so every year we have two Jain nuns that live with us in Miami at the university, and so they have been instrumental. The Samanis have been instrumental in teaching me about Jainism, engaging with them, listening to them, going to the Jain temple. I think that's been really helpful to me as well. So I think that lived reality and the lived tradition has been extremely helpful in terms of translating the texts in the lived reality of these Jain nuns.
You'll be pleased to know, Iqbal,
Sure.
that the day before yesterday,
Uh-huh.
I had lunch with the granddaughter of Frontier Gandhi.
Oh, wow.
I am currently at Atchison College in Lahore, and she is heading
Wonderful.
up
Okay.
Gwen House. And so
Okay.
she introduced me herself. It was very
Wow.
interesting what she said.
Yeah,
She
yeah.
said that my grandfather was not very popular,
Right.
and even is not popular today
Yeah.
because he was against the partition
Right.
of South Asia.
Yeah,
So I
yeah.
figured you'd get a chuckle out of it that,
That's amazing.
I was there. Yes. You
Yeah.
touched upon Jain heritage in Pakistan. Could you
Yes.
just touch upon that? Because it's a
Yeah.
topic that not a lot of information is available. So I think our attendees might appreciate that.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, if you're in Lahore, then you should definitely go to Lahore Museum. They have a very nice,
Yes.
yeah, Jain
They have a
heritage.
whole Jain temple, which is the
Exactly. That's right.
central part of the
Yeah.
museum. You
Yeah.
go in, it's right in front of you. It's not hidden anywhere.
Yes.
It's in your face. Absolutely.
It's amazing. I mean, that's the thing. I think, and the other place you should go if you can go. When I was there, I helped to start the renovation. So there's a metro over there in Lahore that was set up by the Chinese. It's a very nice metro. It's very cheap, but it doesn't really go many places. But it's a nice visit. And one of the stops is the Jain Mandir, the Jain
Yes.
temple. Yeah.
I just went by there yesterday. It's been put
Okay.
up straight and renovated.
Yes,
Yes.
exactly. Yeah, yeah. So it was during the Babri Masjid sort of Ayodhya thing or whatever. Some people got upset and they destroyed they kind of broke the temple, and the Punjabi authorities have kind of have tried to fix it. But all throughout Pakistan, I mean, there's places in Sindh that are very important to Jain. So when we're thinking about like between Pakistan and like basically Western India and kind of what's Pakistan today, there were caravans, right, that would be going back and forth of Jain merchants, right? And there's so many Jain temples that existed in what's now Pakistan that are completely, unfortunately, most of them are just kind of neglected because there's not enough, presence or interest. The place that I think the most important, one of the most sacred places for Jainism would be Taxila. I don't know if you've been to
Mhm.
Taxila yet or not, but that,
Yes, I had several
yeah, okay,
times.
yeah, yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah, yeah.
Yes.
So that's also a very important place for both Jainism and Buddhism, I think, the
Yeah,
sacred
and many
monasteries
of the
there.
stupas that I visited in
Yes,
Daxila now do talk specifically saying that this is not a Buddhist stupa,
right.
this is a Jain
A
stupa,
Jain
and I
stupa,
thought that was
exactly.
very interesting to be.
Yeah,
Thank
I've
you,
been
brother,
we've
for
been working
elaborating on
together
that.
with some of the conservators on trying to highlight Jain
Lovely.
heritage there. Exactly.
Lovely. Well, I'm going to move on to some of the questions that
Mm,
are coming through the chat Q&A box
mm,
and some others that are coming through Facebook Live. But before we do that, you touched upon intellectual violence. Could you talk a bit more about that? What is intellectual violence and how do we as humans contribute towards that? And maybe
yeah.
even put it in a certain context of rather than criticizing any other country, our own country, the United States, and our current
Right.
government.
Right. Yeah. I mean, there are many different levels of intellectual violence. I think that's happening. A lot of, it happens in many different ways. So sometimes like the ways that you frame things with words, right? So there are ways that you can kind of remember or not remember, to allow people to use certain phrases or to not, people not to use certain phrases. So that's one way of kind of thinking about, you know, h- how do you erase history, in terms of kind of how you talk about something. So that those are kind of ways, right? So if we're thinking about kind of in the United States, how do you deal with Native American heritage, right? How do you deal with the violence against that historically was against Black people, but how do you deal with the negative parts of history and at the same time, um, and I think that's again where Anakantavad comes from, because I think what we're seeing in the United States is a challenge between two groups of people, and it's much of this is all in the realm of rhetoric, in the realm of ideas, right? Um, what is America? Is America the WASP country, the white Anglo-Saxon Protestant country of the 1950s? Is that the ideal version of America? Is America some sort of multicultural amalgamation? Is America just irreparably destructive? Right? Is it just kind of a history of oppression? What is America? And so you have people that are kind of they're battling ideas in terms of, and some people don't want other people to say what their truth is or what their perspective is. And so I think the challenge that we have as peace builders of people from faith is being able to both articulate a positive vision and at the same time being able to acknowledge the violence and that existed in the injustices as well, and being able to hold both of these two things together, to articulate a positive vision, a shared vision of the future, and being able to articulate the past, and one doesn't negate the other. You don't have to have a positive vision of America that negates the injustices of the past, and you don't have to just focus on the injustices of the past, and not have and be and to invalidate kind of a majority perspective or majority ideas. And I think that's kind of the tension that exists. And so I think that's kind of the work that, again, Anakantavad allows us to be able to do this plurality of perspectives. And then again, the idea of Ahimsa is that it's not that the violence of the past is uh, infinitely unredeemable, that there's no possibility to go beyond that injustice, that there is a path forward. And again, that's something that's a positive vision that we can sort of articulate.
Well, before I go and ask questions, we have several from the audience.
Sure.
Means I grew up myself in South Asia,
Mm-hmm.
in India and Pakistan.
Mm-hmm.
There is a sense in South Asia, particularly in India,
Uh,
that the Muslims of South Asia of today
uh-huh.
are responsible directly for
Mm-hmm.
the injustices done by the Mughals 500 years ago. That is something that drives hatred towards Muslims of South Asia. As someone who has worked in this area, how do you go about uh, debunking this myth that the Muslims of today of South Asia are responsible for
Yeah.
what the Mughals did 500 years ago.
Yeah, that's a very hard thing. I think one thing is that, none of us are, and I think this is not just something that's happening here. I mean, one of the other
Mhm.
challenges we see also that we're seeing, because I do, again, work with Jewish Muslim sort of dialogue, is how do we deal with the legacy of the Holocaust, right? So, to what extent, when we teach the Holocaust, how do we deal with the fact that the Germans of today are not responsible for what their ancestors did, right, during the time of World War II? And it's unfair that they should be charged with the burden. And at the same time, it's important to remember what had happened, right? So, how do you maintain a memory without burdening sort of the people? I think that's the larger question. And so I think that's something that's important that you can say, okay, we did, for whatever reason, you would say, okay, well, what had happened with the Mughals or with Muslim rule in South Asia is not something that we agreed with, and you can teach that history. But again, the people that are existing today are not responsible for the sins of the past. But even beyond that, I would say that the majority of Muslims in South Asia are not the descendants of Mughals. I mean, the vast majority of Muslims today in Pakistan and Bangladesh and other places are essentially indigenous people, right? That either converted actively or passively in the societies that they were living in through Sufi saints and these other people. So they were not involved in violence. I mean, they were converted through the traditions that existed in the engagement, right? And I think a really good example of this would be thinking of the Ahmadiyya community, but even the Sikh community and the Sikh tradition is also part of this really unique engagement of the Indic traditions with sort of Islamic spirituality. And the majority of the Muslims today are South Asian as well. Their ancestors were Hindu or Jain or Buddhist. So, I would say that it's really inaccurate at many levels to charge them with that.
Thank you. Let's go to questions in Q&A box.
Sure,
The
please.
first one is, and I think you touched upon this thing, but maybe elaborate more on the
Sure.
intersectionality between Ahimsa and
Mhm.
Rehm.
Yes, yes.
On one of your slides, but one of the attendees would like more information.
Yeah, sure, sure. And Ayan, if you'd like to, you can also just email me directly, and I can send you the information. But very quickly, I think, part of what we're trying to do is with so ahimsa again means nonviolence, generally, and it's a complex idea of nonviolence. But I think that also rahm, the idea of sort of mercy or God's compassion, is again something that is actively nonviolent in a way. Right. So God's love for us, God's compassion for humanity or for the world or for creation itself is a type of nonviolent love, right? It's a love that's generative, that's creative, that's engaging. And so I feel like that is one of the ways that we can kind of think of a bridge between God's divine creative love and the idea of nonviolence.
Another question that has come through
Mhm.
Facebook Live is, do
Uh-huh.
Jains preach to spread their faith to others?
Yeah, I think that's a good question. I don't think that it's an active, it's not an active missionary tradition, even though historically, the idea of Jainism and uh, Jainism, I would say Buddhism, Sikhism, many of the Dharmic traditions, aside from traditional Vedic Hinduism, they all, to some extent, are interested in propagating the message. I don't necessarily think that they're actively trying to get new believers, but definitely, I think, at least in the United States with the Jain community here, they believe that there's certain ideals that exist within Jainism that, if adopted by the majority population, would create a more just and loving world. And so, one of the examples that I deal with in the United States with the Jain community is the idea of veganism. And so, many of the Jain communities in the United States are very actively vegan. And the idea is that by being vegan, we um, reduce the burden on the planet of the meat eating and kind of all of that. And it's also much more compassionate. And so we as human beings, if we're more compassionate to animals, and we're also going and to plants, will also be more compassionate towards other human beings. And so it will, through that one thing of thinking about what we're eating and what we're ingesting in our bodies, we can actually make the world a better place. So I think it's more about the philosophy rather than trying to attract converts.
The next question, I'm going to summarize it. It's a long paragraph. Many
Sure.
thanks for sharing the Jain insight of intellectual ahimsa, non-absolutism. Our person here says, I really see many parallels of this in Chinese and Buddhist philosophies, then give some
Mhm.
examples.
Yeah.
And coming to the question that is coming up here,
Yeah.
and that is, it looks like anti-foundationalism slash non-absolutism has been mainstream in many non-Western traditions and cultures throughout history.
Yeah.
I wonder how we, and I think the we here is talking
Yeah.
about Western cultures,
Yeah.
arrived at this age of enlightenment that is so fixated with absolute truth. And if we, the absolutes, are the majority, how can we act like it? How can we gain enough power to be taken seriously?
Yeah, yeah, no, I mean, this is also, I think, the intersection of this is a much more complex issue, but I think it also comes from the turn that the West takes in terms of materialism. So and then kind of the idea of the scientific revolution, things that can be falsifiable. So there's a whole sort of intellectual tradition that then takes a type of absolutism. And I think also to an extent, um, one of the challenges, I think, yeah, so I think that's one of the challenges is that the type of absolutist thinking is I mean, you've also always had people with power dominating other people. I think that's all throughout human history, unfortunately. But I think sort of this absolutism, I think, comes out of sort of Western political thought, and then the creation of modern ideology, scientific thinking, some of the scientific racism that comes out of that as well, and that ends up then becoming exported to different parts of the world. So I think part of what you're saying, I think, which is a very good point, is that many of the Asian traditions have these ideas of having a complexity of sort of perspectives and sort of ideas. And so being able to recover that, I think, is important. And we can do that in terms of the way that we write, in terms of the way that we think, in terms of the ways that we engage and reach out to the other. I think those are really important first steps to be able to recover that.
The last question in the chat box I will
Mm.
ask is, many
Okay.
spiritual traditions also embrace the concept of spiritual warrior as
Mm,
a motive for the spiritual journey and give some
mm.
examples. Warrior sage in the Sikh faith,
Yeah, yeah.
Shaolin monks in Buddhist,
Mm.
Jihad in Islam, Knight Templar Christian. And the question is there an opportunity to move from the perception of violence in these traditions to a more non-violent interpretation of these traditions?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, even within Islam, you have the idea of Jihad al-Kabir and Jihad al-Saghir. So Jihad al-Saghir is kind of the violence, right? The smaller jihad, which is the one that you're actually, fighting against people. And the Jihad al-Kabir is the larger jihad is actually the one against the self, right? Sort of the inward journey. The idea that there's this eternal battle within the soul. And so you're constantly have to be vigilant in terms of trying to um, cultivate a life of character, a life of virtue, a life of intentionality, a life of compassion. And that is a journey and a battle that sort of takes you throughout the rest of your life. And so I think all of these traditions have that, and being able to emphasize that. I think that's something that we don't do enough of in the contemporary world, is the idea that in the medieval past, one of the things that was very important was the cultivation of character. That was a very important part of what it meant to be a gentleman or a gentlewoman, right? A person of high worth in society was someone who had cultivated learning, who had cultivated character. That was like someone that was kind of really aspired to, and that was an ideal person. And I think kind of trying to revive that is a very important part again of then changing the world that we live in, because unfortunately we're living in a world today where people who are very famous or valorized are not necessarily people of exemplary character. It's either through power or through wealth that people are kind of lauded. And I think if we're able to kind of invert that and say, the people that we should look up to are the people of that have cultivated character, people that are of compassion, the people that have been able to change um, the world through their strength of character. I think then, that can help us to get onto a better path, you know. And I'm very saddened, even in places like India, how these important people like Mahatma Gandhi, their you know, their value, I think that is very, very powerful and very important in terms of history and as a model, has also been weakened, you know. So I think that part of the work that we should be able to do is to uphold people of character as you know, and so that I think helps us because then we have a model to aspire to, right? So sometimes when we think about, at least in the Islamic tradition, the Prophet Muhammad or the Jinnas in Jainism, right? Sometimes they're so abstract, they're so part of this ancient history that it's hard to kind of connect with. But someone like Gandhi or Martin Luther King or some people like that, they're closer to us in time. And I think they provide us a better model of how to be in this world. And it's easier to access. Yeah.
The two last questions. The
Please.
first one is help us understand this dichotomy
Mhm.
that the Jain community is very influential in Gujarat.
Yeah.
That is also the state where Mr. Modi, who
Right.
has been the banner for Hindutva and right-wing
Yeah.
Hindu nationalism,
Yeah. Yeah.
in India, gets a lot of support from.
Yeah.
How do you help us understand that?
Well, I think this is the contradiction that we see in a lot of the you know, a lot of the faith communities, unfortunately, is that a lot of times there's a disconnect. I mean, I think part of it for the Jain community as well is that I mean, I don't think the Jains are driving Hindutva, but the challenge as well is that they're a minority community and they are I would say they're a very vulnerable community as well. And so I think it politically it's a better idea to be on the side of power than not. I mean, there's another community that's very interesting. Because there are also Muslim communities, interestingly enough, that are pro Modi, right? So the there's a small community in Gujarat also. They're known as the Bohras, and so they're kind of a Muslim, yeah, community, and you know they dress very uniquely, Ismaili community, and they're a small minority merchant community, and they also side on the side of power as well. So I feel like it's more like a hedging strategy
Yes.
than being true believers. Yeah,
Wonderful.
yeah,
Brother, my last question to
sure.
you is that, as you know, currently the month of Ramadan is going on,
Yes, right.
and I'm here at Atchison College,
Uh-huh.
and for lunchtime, all the boarding houses, except the one for the junior school,
Mm.
are closed.
Uh-huh.
The students who are in junior school do not fast. So
All
I
right.
will be going tomorrow, as
Okay.
always, to have my lunch there,
Okay.
and I'm quite sure I will meet the granddaughter of
Uh-huh.
Badsha Khan again.
Oh, wow,
What
wonderful.
is it that you would like me to convey to him as somebody who admires nonviolence
Yeah.
and the work that he has done? What would you like me to say to her tomorrow?
Yeah, I mean, I would, you know, again, I'm so happy to hear that you're in Pakistan. I think that this is something that Pakistanis really need, and I'm sure you've had a very good experience living there. And it's really remarkable. I think people don't understand enough about Pakistan. They think it's kind of this extremely crazy, violent place, and there's a lot of people who are so, I mean, the Pakistani students especially have a thirst for a desire to learn and a desire to engage with the outside world, and I'm sure they're very happy to see you.
Yes.
I think for me, I would, you know, just to say that um, there are, we need more voices for actively thinking about peace in the Islamic tradition. And so, how do we, you know, um, how do we, you know, give a loudspeaker to those voices because I think unfortunately the more violent extremists within the Muslim world, they're the ones who kind of get the media coverage. And I like you're saying in Pakistan, the vast majority of people are not violent. They just kind of want to live their lives and they would be open to you know, peaceful living with other people. And so I think just you know what is some sort of strategies that we could do to enhance that within the religious class in Pakistan among the mullahs in the seminaries and then even in public and media discourse. If there's any guidance, any ideas, I think that would be really helpful.
Brother, I will take
Yeah.
your question to
Yeah.
her and I
All
will
right.
then get back to you by
Thank you.
email and get you an answer. But thank you so much, brother Iqbal Akhtar, for sharing your wisdom, your knowledge and your expertise with us on a topic that is not very well known. So thank you. Also want to thank each one of you who is with us here today on Zoom and through Facebook Live. Tomorrow, all of you registered through Zoom will receive an email which will have a link to today's webinar. It will also have the email address of Dr. Akhtar and some of the websites where he
Yes.
writes. As many of you might be aware, I mentioned in my introduction that he is one of the few Muslim scholars who has engaged with the Jewish community post October 7th. So we hope to bring him back sometime when he has a little more free time to come and talk about that important topic also. And now please go in peace as we strive in our own parts of the world to create pathways to peace and justice. Thank you
Thank you.
and goodbye.
Thank you.
Bye bye.
Bye bye.